I was on a conference call with 3 lawyers discussing the final details of our family business sale when I heard something that made my blood freeze. The lead attorney from the buyer's side said matter-of-factly, "And we've received the signed authorization from Miss Hayworth, executed by her designated proxy, her brother Camden Hayworth, as outlined in the preliminary agreements." I sat up straighter in my chair, my hand tightening around my phone, because I had never designated my brother as my proxy for anything, let alone a transaction worth $175 million. I'd never given him permission to sign documents on my behalf, never discussed proxy authorization, never even been told this was happening. Everyone on the call went quiet when I asked them to repeat what they'd just said. And in that silence I could hear my parents breathing on their end of the line. Not shocked or confused breathing, but relieved breathing, like they'd been waiting for this moment to pass without incident. My father cleared his throat and said we should discuss the details offline, that this wasn't the time or place. My mother added quickly that everything had been handled properly, that there was no need for concern. But my brother Camden stayed silent, which was unusual because he was never silent when he thought he'd won something. The attorney asked if there was a problem with the authorization, and I said yes, there was a very significant problem, and I needed to see all documentation immediately. The call ended abruptly with promises to send me the full file, and I immediately called my parents back, demanding to know what was happening. My mother answered sounding nervous and defensive, saying they'd thought I was too emotional to handle the negotiation process, that I'd been stressed and overwhelmed by the complexity of the sale, and that it had just been easier to let Camden handle my portion of the transaction, along with his own. Easier for who, I asked, because it certainly hadn't been easier for me to be excluded from decisions about my own assets. My father got on the line and explained that Camden had legal and financial experience, that he'd been managing the negotiations for months, and that they'd all agreed it made sense for him to streamline the process by representing both his interests and mine. I asked when exactly they'd all agreed to this, and my father said it had been discussed at several family meetings I'd apparently not been invited to. Camden finally spoke up, his voice carrying that smug tone I'd heard my entire life whenever he thought he'd outmaneuvered me. He said someone had to make the grown-up decisions, that these kinds of transactions required focus and expertise, and that I should be grateful he'd protected my interests while I was too busy being emotional to pay attention. I asked him what gave him the legal authority to sign anything on my behalf, and he laughed and said our parents had arranged it, that everything was perfectly legal, and that I was overreacting as usual. Let me tell you who I am, because my family's version of me doesn't match reality. My name is Natalie Hayworth, I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 30 years quietly building wealth through real estate investments, technology consulting, and strategic partnerships that nobody in my family paid much attention to because I didn't brag about them. I was always the responsible one, the one who handled problems without drama, the one who helped family members with financial advice and never asked for public credit. I'd co-founded the family business with my father 28 years ago, putting in equal capital and equal work. But over the years, my brother Camden had positioned himself as the face of the company, while I focused on operations and growth. Our business had started as a small commercial property management firm and had grown into a portfolio worth hundreds of millions. And now we were selling to a private equity group for a total value of $175 million. My share should have been substantial, at minimum 40% based on my ownership stake and contributions. I'd trusted my family more than I'd trusted contracts, which in hindsight was the kind of mistake that costs people everything. I'd assumed that when the sale happened, everyone would be honest about who owned what and who'd contributed what. That trust had apparently just cost me 9 figures, and I was only now beginning to understand how badly I'd miscalculated. The transaction summary arrived in my email at 11 p.m., and I opened it with shaking hands. The total sale price was $175 million as expected, but when I scrolled down to the distribution breakdown, my stomach dropped. Camden was listed as receiving $98 million as majority principal and primary operator. My father was receiving $52 million for his founding stake and advisory role, and I was listed as receiving $25 million as a passive beneficiary and limited partner. $25 million for 30 years of work, for half the initial capital, for the operational systems I'd built that made the company valuable enough to sell in the first place. I was categorized as a passive beneficiary, a term that suggested I'd done nothing but exist while others built value. That designation changed everything. It meant I wasn't being recognized as an owner or active participant, just as someone who'd passively benefited from other people's work. The breakdown showed Camden receiving nearly 4 times what I was getting, despite the fact that I'd been working in this business since before he'd graduated college. I read through the supporting documentation showing how they'd arrived at these numbers, and every page rewrote history. My contributions were minimized or attributed to Camden. My capital investments were described as family loans. My operational leadership was characterized as administrative support. Someone had systematically erased me from my own company's story, and the paperwork made it look legitimate and reasonable. We had a family dinner 3 days later, supposedly to celebrate the successful sale negotiation, and I watched my brother hold court like he'd single-handedly built an empire. He joked about finally handling grown-up money, about the responsibility of managing a 9-figure payout, about the investment strategies he was considering. My parents beamed at him, proud and relieved, while my sister-in-law took photos for social media. Everyone laughed at his stories about negotiating with the buyers, about the late-night strategy sessions, about the complexity of the deal structure. Nobody mentioned my name, or my role, or my share. I sat there picking at my food, not laughing, watching my brother perform his victory lap, while my parents acted like this was exactly how things should be. When my mother asked if I was okay, I said I was fine, just tired, and she patted my hand and said it must be such a relief to have Camden handling everything so I didn't have to worry. My father raised his glass in a toast to Camden's leadership and vision, and everyone drank except me. I was quiet because I'd spent the last 72 hours reading every page of that transaction summary, studying every clause, comparing the terms to my actual ownership records, and I'd found something. Multiple somethings, actually. My brother had made mistakes in his rush to erase me, and those mistakes were about to cost him everything he thought he'd won. Late at night, after that dinner, I sat in my home office reviewing the documents line by line with my own records spread across my desk. I had copies of the original partnership agreement from 1996, capitalization tables showing my investments over the years, board meeting minutes where my strategic decisions had been documented, emails and memos proving my operational authority. And in the transaction documents Camden had signed, one phrase kept appearing that bothered me more each time I read it. Limited authority granted by principal shareholder Natalie Hayworth for negotiation purposes. Limited authority for negotiation, which implied I'd given him permission to negotiate terms but not to finalize or execute. I searched my files for any document where I'd granted him this authority, any email or letter or signed agreement, and found nothing. I'd never authorized him to negotiate on my behalf. I'd never been asked to authorize him. The phrase suggested a formal delegation of power that had never actually occurred, which meant either the documents were wrong or someone had forged my authorization. I pulled out the signature page from the proxy authorization document, and there it was. My signature, or something that looked like my signature, dated 8 months ago on a document I'd never seen before. The signature wasn't quite right, the loops were too tight, and the baseline was too straight. Someone had created a fake authorization to make Camden's representation look legitimate, and my parents had either known about it or hadn't asked questions they should have asked. I called an independent attorney first thing Monday morning, someone with no connection to my family or our business, and asked for an emergency consultation. Her name was Victoria Sterling, a corporate attorney who specialized in shareholder disputes and fiduciary breaches. And when I laid out the situation in her conference room, she listened without interrupting. I showed her the transaction summary with my reduced share, the proxy authorization with the questionable signature, my original partnership documents proving my actual ownership stake, and the communications trail showing I'd been excluded from negotiations. She reviewed everything carefully, and when she got to the proxy authorization page, she stopped, reread it, and then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She asked if I'd signed this document, and I said absolutely not. I'd never seen it before last week. She pointed to a clause in tiny print at the bottom of the page that said proxy authority was valid for negotiation only and required principal confirmation before final execution of any binding agreements. Then she looked up and said, "They assumed you wouldn't notice this. They assumed you'd be so grateful for $25 million that you wouldn't read the fine print or question the process. But this clause means they needed your direct approval before finalizing the sale, and they don't have it." I asked what that meant legally, and she said it meant the transaction as currently structured wasn't valid, that my portion couldn't be sold without my explicit consent, and that someone had crossed a very serious legal line by representing to the buyers that my approval had been obtained when it hadn't. Victoria explained that the documents technically required my direct consent for any asset transfer, that a proxy could negotiate terms and present options, but couldn't finalize or execute a binding sale without the principal's signature and confirmation. Camden had apparently exceeded his authority he'd never actually been granted in the first place, by signing final agreements on my behalf. The buyers likely didn't know about this issue, because they'd relied on the representations made in the proxy authorization, but that didn't change the legal reality. My signature was required, not my brother's, and without it, my portion of the sale was incomplete, regardless of what Camden or my parents believed. Victoria asked if I wanted to challenge this, and I said yes, absolutely, because this wasn't about hurt feelings or family drama. This was about someone stealing my ownership stake through fraudulent documentation. She said we'd need to act quickly before the transaction closed, and she'd start by sending a formal notice to all parties that my consent had not been obtained and that any representations to the contrary were incorrect. I authorized her to proceed, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Someone finally understood that this wasn't me being emotional or difficult. This was me refusing to be robbed by people who thought family loyalty meant I'd accept whatever they decided to give me. I sent one calm, carefully worded email to my parents and brother, CCing my attorney, asking a simple question. On what specific legal basis was my authority to approve the final sale terms waived? And can you please provide documentation showing where I granted Camden full power to execute binding agreements on my behalf? The email was professional, not angry, just asking for clarification about the process. I sent it at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the silence that followed was deafening. Usually my family responded to messages within minutes, especially about business matters, but this email sat unanswered for hours. My mother finally replied at 4 p.m., saying we should discuss this in person, not over email, that there were misunderstandings that needed to be cleared up face-to-face. My father sent a separate message saying he was disappointed I was making this difficult, that the deal was good for everyone, and that I was jeopardizing the sale by raising procedural questions at the last minute. But notice what neither of them did. Neither of them answered my actual question. Neither of them provided the documentation I'd requested. Neither of them explained the legal basis for waiving my approval rights. Camden didn't respond at all, which was the loudest silence of them all. I forwarded the non-responses to Victoria, and she said their refusal to answer was telling, that people with legitimate authority provide documentation immediately when questioned, and people without legitimate authority deflect and delay. The silence was louder than any denial could have been, and it confirmed what I'd already started to suspect. There was no legitimate basis for what they'd done. Camden called me 2 days later. His voice suddenly friendly and conciliatory, completely different from the smug tone he'd used at dinner. He said there seemed to be some misunderstanding about the authorization process, that perhaps the attorneys hadn't explained things clearly to me, that obviously nobody was trying to exclude me or minimize my role. He suggested we smooth things over privately, just the two of us, without involving lawyers or making this into a bigger issue than it needed to be. He said families should be able to work things out without formal legal proceedings, that attorneys just complicated simple matters and cost everyone money. I asked him again where I'd authorized him to sign final sale documents on my behalf, and he said it had been implied by my participation in early discussions that by not objecting earlier, I'd essentially given consent. I told him that's not how legal authorization works, that implied consent doesn't override explicit signature requirements, and that I wanted to see the actual document granting him power of attorney. He changed tactics, saying I was being unreasonable, that he'd worked incredibly hard to get us this deal, that I should be grateful instead of creating problems. I told him I was done smoothing things over, done accepting implications instead of documentation, done being told I was being difficult for asking basic questions about my own assets. He said I was making a mistake that would cost the whole family, and I said no, he'd made the mistake by assuming I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. Then I hung up while he was still talking. Over the next week, I played the role they expected perfectly. When my mother called asking if we could talk, I said sure, I just wanted clarity and transparency. When my father suggested a family meeting, I agreed pleasantly and said I was looking forward to understanding the process better. I acted confused rather than angry, grateful rather than suspicious, cooperative rather than combative. I let them think I was backing down, that Camden's call had worked, that I was returning to my usual role of going along with whatever the family decided. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything, every phone call, every email, every conversation, every inconsistency in their explanations. I recorded the family meeting where my father tried to explain that Camden's authority had been understood rather than formalized, and I asked innocent-sounding questions that revealed gaps in their story. I saved voicemails where Camden contradicted himself about when he'd supposedly received authorization. I collected every piece of communication showing I'd been systematically excluded from meetings and decisions. Victoria was building a file that demonstrated a clear pattern. I'd been kept in the dark deliberately. My authority had been usurped without legal basis. And my family had assumed I'd be too passive or too grateful for whatever scraps they offered to challenge what they'd done. They thought I was folding, but I was actually preparing for war. 2 weeks into our investigation, Victoria called me with news that made everything worse. She'd hired a forensic accountant to review the valuation methodology used to determine everyone's shares, and they'd found something disturbing. The assumptions used to calculate the business value had been systematically manipulated to minimize my portion and maximize Camden's. Specifically, my capital contributions over the years had been characterized as personal loans rather than equity investments, which meant they weren't counted toward my ownership percentage. My operational work had been valued at standard employee compensation rates, rather than as executive leadership deserving equity credit. Meanwhile, Camden's more recent involvement had been weighted heavily as active management, deserving majority ownership, even though he'd only been significantly involved for the past 8 years, compared to my 30. The valuation model had been designed to produce a predetermined outcome. Camden as majority owner, me as passive beneficiary. Victoria said this wasn't a mistake or a difference of professional opinion. This was strategic manipulation of data to justify an unfair distribution. She said whoever had structured this valuation knew exactly what they were doing and had counted on me not understanding financial modeling well enough to catch it. That assumption was wrong. I'd spent 3 decades analyzing business valuations and financial structures. I knew exactly how they'd rigged the numbers, and I had the documentation to prove it. Victoria sent a formal request for clarification to all parties, my parents, Camden, the buyers, and their legal team, outlining the issues we'd identified and requesting full documentation of the authorization process, the valuation methodology, and the decision-making timeline. The letter was professional but pointed, making clear that we'd identified serious irregularities that needed to be resolved before any transaction could proceed. She CC'd external counsel to ensure there was a formal record, and the response was immediate and panicked. My mother called me crying within an hour of the letter being received, saying I was tearing the family apart, and that we'd always worked things out privately, that bringing lawyers into family matters was hurtful and unnecessary. I told her that what was hurtful was being erased from my own company's history and having my contributions stolen through fraudulent paperwork. She said nobody had stolen anything, that Camden had worked hard to negotiate a fair deal, that I was being ungrateful and vindictive. I asked her if she'd known about the forged proxy authorization, and she went quiet. Then she said she'd trusted Camden to handle the legal details and hadn't questioned the process. I asked if she understood that trust wasn't a substitute for legal compliance, and she started crying harder. My father's response was different. He went completely quiet, which scared me more than my mother's tears. He sent one brief email saying he'd need to consult with counsel before responding further, which meant he'd finally realized this was serious. The meeting happened in a sterile conference room at the buyer's attorney's office, all of us sitting around a long table with lawyers flanking every side. My parents looked exhausted and worried. Camden looked angry, his jaw tight and his eyes hard. I sat across from them with Victoria beside me, calm and prepared. The buyer's lead attorney started by saying they needed to resolve the authorization issue before proceeding, but their due diligence had relied on representations that now appeared questionable. Camden immediately jumped in, explaining that he'd been managing the family business for years, that everyone had understood he'd be handling the sale, that his authority had been implied by years of operational control. He talked over me twice when I tried to respond, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. He accused me of sabotaging the deal, of being jealous of his success, of trying to destroy what he'd built. He said families shouldn't need contracts and formal authorizations, that trust should be enough, that I was betraying everyone by questioning his integrity. Victoria let him talk himself into a corner, taking notes while he contradicted himself and revealed things he shouldn't have known if the authorization had been legitimate. Then, when he finally paused for breath, she slid one document across the table. A single page, highlighted in yellow, showing the clause that required my explicit approval for any final execution of sale terms. The room went silent as everyone read it. The clause was clear and unambiguous. Proxy authority for negotiation purposes only. Final execution of binding sale agreements requires direct written authorization from principal shareholder, obtained no less than 10 business days prior to closing, and independently verified by counsel. Camden's face went pale as he read it, and I watched him realize what Victoria had known all along. The deal wasn't complete because I'd never provided the required authorization. The buyer's attorney asked pointedly when this final written authorization had been obtained, and Camden said it had been implied that my participation in early meetings constituted agreement. The attorney said, respectfully, that implication didn't satisfy the explicit requirement in the documentation Camden himself had signed. My father tried to intervene, saying this was a technicality, that obviously everyone had intended for Camden to represent the family's interests. Victoria responded that legal requirements weren't technicalities, and intentions didn't override explicit contractual terms. She pointed out that this clause confirmed I retained final authority at all times, that the proxy authorization, even if it had been legitimately granted, which it hadn't, was limited to negotiation only, and that the deal as currently structured was legally incomplete. The buyer's attorney asked for a recess to consult with his clients, and everyone filed out except Victoria and me. She looked at me and said, "They just realized their entire transaction is built on sand." After the recess, the meeting resumed with a completely different tone. The buyers were now asking questions about the validity of all the transaction documents, and Camden was getting increasingly defensive and angry. He slammed his hand on the table and said I was betraying the family, that we'd worked our entire lives to build this business, that I was destroying everything out of spite. He accused me of being vindictive and petty, of using legal technicalities to hurt people who loved me. Then he said something that revealed everything. Family shouldn't need contracts. You should trust me because I'm your brother. I looked at him and said, "That's interesting. Because you used plenty of contracts when you were excluding me from decisions and minimizing my ownership stake. Apparently family doesn't need contracts when you want me to stay quiet, but you needed extensive legal documentation when you were taking what was mine." Victoria added that it was particularly ironic to claim family trust was sufficient when he'd literally forged authorization documents, which was the opposite of trust. Camden's attorney, who'd been quiet until now, intervened and said perhaps everyone should take a step back, that emotions were running high and that cooler heads needed to prevail. My mother begged me to be reasonable, to think about the family, to consider how this was affecting everyone. I told her I'd been reasonable for 30 years, and it had gotten me erased from my own company's history and nearly defrauded out of millions of dollars. I was done being reasonable on terms that benefited everyone but me. 2 days later, the buyers formally paused the transaction pending clarification of ownership and authorization issues. Millions of dollars that had been moving toward closing were suddenly frozen, sitting in escrow accounts while lawyers argued about validity and authority. The pressure on my family was immediate and intense. Camden had apparently already spent money against his expected payout, down payments on properties, commitments to investments, promises to business partners. My father had made retirement plans based on his share. Everyone had assumed this deal was done, and now it was unraveling because I'd refused to accept being cheated. My brother called me screaming that I was costing the family millions in delayed closing costs and jeopardized valuations, that buyers were getting nervous and might walk away entirely, that this was all my fault for being difficult. I told him the deal got paused because he committed fraud, not because I noticed it. My parents tried a different approach, sending my aunt to talk to me about family harmony and forgiveness, about how holding grudges hurt everyone, about how I should think about future holidays and relationships. I told her that family harmony built on theft isn't harmony. It's just organized injustice. The extended family started taking sides, some calling me brave for standing up for myself, others saying I was destroying the family over money. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't about the money anymore. It was about whether I'd accept being erased from my own story to make other people comfortable. Camden and my parents made one last attempt to resolve things on their terms. They offered me a revised payout, $42 million instead of $25 million, if I'd sign retroactively and agree to move forward without further challenges. They positioned it as a compromise, as the meeting me halfway, as a generous offer given the complications I'd created. My father presented it as the smart financial choice, saying $42 million was life-changing money, and I should take it and be grateful. Camden added that if I kept fighting, the deal might collapse entirely and I'd end up with nothing. My mother said she just wanted peace, that family was more important than money, that she was begging me to accept this offer so we could all move forward. They gave me 48 hours to decide, and the pressure from extended family was intense. Cousins calling to say I should take the deal, aunts texting that I was being stubborn, uncles suggesting I was letting pride destroy practical outcomes. But Victoria had shown me the real numbers. My actual ownership stake, based on capital contributions and operational authority documented in our original agreements, was worth minimum 45% of the sale price. 45% of $175 million was $78.75 million, not $42 million. They were offering me barely half of what I was legally entitled to and calling it a compromise. I looked at my parents sitting across from me in my living room, waiting for my answer, and I said no without blinking. My father asked what more I wanted, and I said I wanted what was actually mine, not what they'd decided to give me. Victoria's formal findings came back 3 weeks later, and they were devastating for my family. The independent legal review confirmed that the proxy authorization was fraudulent. The signature wasn't mine, the document had been backdated, and there was no legitimate chain of authority granting Camden power to execute final agreements on my behalf. The valuation analysis confirmed systematic manipulation to minimize my ownership percentage and maximize Camden's. The financial forensics showed that my capital contributions had been deliberately miscategorized to reduce my equity stake. Most damaging, the review found evidence that Camden had breached his fiduciary duty as a business partner by negotiating terms that benefited himself at my expense, while claiming to represent my interests. Victoria's report used words like unauthorized execution, material misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and potential fraud. She sent copies to all parties, including the buyers, whose attorneys responded immediately, saying they were suspending all negotiations pending resolution of these serious allegations. The consequences were no longer theoretical or distant. They were immediate and crushing. Camden's promotion to CEO of the acquiring company, which had been part of his deal, was rescinded. My father's consulting agreement with the buyers was put on hold. The entire transaction was now under legal review, and the buyers were considering whether to walk away entirely or demand completely restructured terms. My family had thought they could manage me into acceptance, and instead, they'd triggered exactly the kind of legal scrutiny they'd tried to avoid. The family divided in ways that shocked me. My younger sister, who I'd barely spoken to in years, because she'd always sided with Camden, called to say she'd suspected something was wrong but had been afraid to speak up. She said Camden had pressured her to support his version of events and had threatened to cut her out of family gatherings if she questioned him. Two cousins who worked in the business reached out privately to say they'd witnessed Camden taking credit for my work and had documentation if I needed it. My aunt, my father's sister, sent a letter saying she'd loaned me startup capital 30 years ago because she'd believed in my vision, and she was disgusted that her brother had let Camden erase my contributions. But others chose differently. My uncle told everyone I was tearing the family apart over greed. Former business partners sent messages saying I should let it go for peace. Extended family members begged me to stop the legal action and accept a compromise, any compromise, so family gatherings wouldn't be awkward. One cousin actually said I should consider Camden's feelings, that publicly challenging him was humiliating for him. I told her that Camden should have considered my feelings before forging my signature and stealing my ownership stake. The family split wasn't about who was right or wrong legally. Everyone knew what Camden had done. It was about who valued truth over comfort, who prioritized justice over peace. The transaction resumed 4 months later under completely new terms. This time I was sole signatory for my assets, with my own attorney reviewing every page and my own financial advisor confirming valuations. The buyers had initially considered walking away, but decided the business was still valuable enough to proceed if ownership issues were resolved clearly. Camden fought every step of the restructuring, trying to maintain some control over my portion of the sale, arguing that splitting the representation would complicate negotiations. The buyers' attorneys shut that down immediately, saying they wouldn't proceed unless there was crystal clear authorization from all parties. My parents tried to mediate, suggesting we could still present a unified family front, with both of us signing our respective portions. I told them no, this wasn't about family unity anymore. This was about legal clarity and proper authorization. Victoria negotiated new terms that accurately reflected my ownership stake based on the original partnership agreements and my documented contributions over 3 decades. Camden watched as his majority control was revealed to be largely fictional, built on misattributed work and manipulated valuations. The new structure showed what should have been obvious all along. He was an important part of the business, but so was I, and our shares should have been roughly equal. When the final terms were approved by the buyers, Camden was removed entirely from representing my interests. His proxy authorization was formally revoked, and I had complete authority over my portion of the sale. The revised numbers came in, and they were dramatically different from the original breakdown. My share was now $76 million, based on accurate valuation of my ownership stake, my capital contributions, and my operational authority over the years. Camden's share dropped to $61 million, reflecting his actual contributions without the inflated credit he'd given himself. My father's portion remained roughly the same at $38 million. The shift was stark. I'd gone from being allocated $25 million as a passive beneficiary to receiving $76 million as a principal owner and active partner. Camden had gone from claiming $98 million as majority owner to receiving $61 million as an equal partner who'd overstated his contributions. The difference between what they tried to give me and what I was actually entitled to was $51 million. Essentially 2 full fortunes they'd attempted to redistribute away from me through manipulation and fraud. When Camden saw the revised numbers, he tried one last time to challenge them, claiming the new valuation was punitive and politically motivated. The buyer's attorneys responded with a detailed analysis showing exactly how the original numbers had been manipulated and how the new numbers reflected actual ownership based on documented evidence. Someone else's share had shrunk to nearly nothing, the share that had been built on lies. Camden's attorney advised him to accept the terms before the buyers walked away entirely, and he had no choice but to agree. I signed my portion of the final agreement slowly and deliberately, my hand steady, while my family watched in silence. My parents came to my house 2 weeks after the final signatures, both of them looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen them. My mother said they'd never thought it would go this far, that they'd believed Camden when he'd said he could handle everything, that they'd trusted him to be fair to everyone. My father said he was ashamed that he hadn't asked harder questions when Camden had presented the original authorization documents, that he'd wanted to believe his son was capable of managing everything honestly. They both apologized for not protecting me, for not noticing I'd been excluded, for allowing Camden to manipulate the process. My mother cried and said she didn't know how to fix what had been broken, that the family was fractured in ways she didn't know how to heal. I told them I appreciated the apology, but it came too late to change what had happened or how it had affected my trust in them. I asked my father if he'd known the proxy authorization was forged, and he said no, he'd assumed it was legitimate, because Camden had presented it confidently. I asked my mother if she'd noticed that I'd been excluded from negotiations, and she admitted she'd thought it was strange, but had trusted Camden's explanation that I was too busy to be involved. They'd chosen comfort over curiosity, trust over verification, and it had nearly cost me everything. I told them I'd learned an important lesson. I'd thought it would never go this far either, but I'd been prepared to go however far was necessary to protect what was mine. That was the difference between us. The final signatures happened in a different conference room with different energy. This time, I sat at the center of the table with Victoria beside me, the buyer's attorneys across from us, and my portion of the sale documents in front of me, requiring only my signature. Camden wasn't in the room. He'd signed his portion separately with his own attorney, unable to face me after everything that had been exposed. My parents weren't there either, having decided that their presence would be too painful for everyone. It was just me, my attorney, and the transaction that finally, after months of fighting, accurately reflected my value and my contributions. I read every page before signing, taking my time, asking questions when language was unclear, verifying numbers against my own records. Nobody rushed me or pressured me or told me I was being too careful. When I finally picked up the pen, I signed my name slowly and deliberately, watching the ink form letters that represented 3 decades of work finally being acknowledged and compensated fairly. The buyer's attorney witnessed my signature, confirmed the authorization was properly executed, and congratulated me on completing the transaction. This time, no one spoke for me. No one represented my interests but me. No one's signature appeared on my documents except my own. It was the first time in this entire process that I'd had complete control. And that control felt better than any amount of money. Looking back now, 6 months after everything was finalized, I realized that I didn't destroy my family. I corrected a lie they'd been telling themselves and trying to make me believe. The lie was that Camden had built the business, and I'd just been along for the ride. That his work was worth 4 times mine. That I should be grateful for whatever share they decided to give me. Correcting that lie wasn't vindictive or vengeful. It was necessary and right. I didn't take revenge when I challenged the fraudulent authorization. I took control of my own story and my own assets. I refused to let other people's comfort matter more than my truth. Some family relationships survived the process, and some didn't. My sister and I are closer now than we've been in years, because she respects that I fought for myself. My parents and I have a relationship built on honesty instead of assumptions, which is harder, but healthier. Camden and I don't speak, and I'm okay with that, because I don't trust him and don't need him in my life. The family gatherings are smaller and sometimes awkward, but they're not built on unspoken resentment and hidden fraud. I learned that family betrayal does hurt more than any enemy could, because enemies are expected to attack while family is supposed to protect. But I also learned that clarity beats both betrayal and revenge. Clarity about what you're worth, clarity about what you'll accept, clarity about when to stop being nice and start being honest. And if there's one thing I'd tell anyone facing similar treatment, it's this. Read the paperwork, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that asking for what's yours is the same as being greedy. Because the moment my brother signed my name without permission, he lost the right to lecture me about family loyalty.